Welcome. Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Really excited to be hosting, I think it's our 8th Gamechanger session today. And for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, Gamechanger Sessions is a free weekly live stream where we really bring experts and thought leaders who can help us not just survive during these times of uncertainty and chaos and exponential change, but really thrive. And so we've had some brilliant minds and really warm hearts on the show to date, including Adam Grant, Julie Hanna, Roger Martin, Albert Wenger, Margaret Atwood. And I am delighted to be introducing an exceptional human today, somebody who has impacted my life from afar for many years. Stephen Kotler is joining us. And for those of you who don't know Stephen, he is a New York Times bestselling author and an award-winning journalist. He is also the executive director of the Flow Research Collective and is truly one of the world's leading experts on high performance and flow. Stephen is a prolific writer. He's written so many amazing books. I've tried to read as many as I can. Abundance, Bold. His third just came out in this exponential mindset trilogy called The Future is Faster Than You Think. He wrote Tomorrowland. He wrote The Rise of Superman, Stealing Fire, and he is really, really amazing. I'm so excited to introduce him. Welcome, Stephen. Thanks for joining me today.
It's good to be with you.
Great. How are you doing?
I'm super well, thank you. How are you?
I'm really good. Sitting in sunny Toronto right now, so I can't complain. Where are you today?
Northern Nevada, South Lake Tahoe.
Nice. Awesome. How late in the year can you ski there until, or snowboard?
Well, I'm looking out my window and I can see Kirkwood and there's still snow up there. So if they were to open the mountain again, I could ski today.
Sounds good. Awesome. So Stephen, it is such a joy for me to be here because you live at the intersection of so many things that I'm passionate about. High performance, creativity, flow states, altered states, and the future. And I hope we are going to dive into as many of those wonderful themes as possible. But before we get started, I'm just really curious, how did you get so curious about flow? What's your story that led you to this passion for flow?
It's sort of a two-part story, Candice. When I was first starting out as a journalist in the early 1990s, I had always been fascinated by those moments in time that the impossible became possible. And history is sort of littered with those moments, right? We see it all the time. And I just got very curious. I was like, well, people are saying this, we can't do this, it'll never get done. And then it gets done, and you see it fairly frequently. So I was very obsessed with that. And I guess I took that curiosity into journalism, and I explored everything from the athletic side of the coin. So I would look at performance sports, for example, as the 90s was going up and up and up, and all these things that people had said were never going to get done just kept getting done, and I wanted to understand how. And I was seeing the same thing. The 90s were an amazing decade in technology. So we had all this sci-fi technology. It had been sci-fi technology up till around the 90s, and then a lot of it started to become science fact. So on both sides of the equation, I was there, and it was actually a really good marriage for me. Is that whenever you see the impossible become possible, you're usually seeing kind of people learning how to extend human capability, often with flow, and harness disruptive technology. So when those two things come together, not always, but often, that's when you start to see the impossible become possible. And then I think the story you're referencing is I had all these questions. I was doing this. I didn't really know what I was looking at. I knew I was looking at really amazing human performance puzzles. And when I was 30 years old, I got Lyme disease, spent about 3 years in bed. I was very sick. At the end of it, to keep a very long story and make it very short, I got bit by a tick. Same way everybody else gets Lyme disease. It wasn't fancy. I was at a wedding in Long Island and got bit by a tick. at the end of it, I was sort of dragged to the ocean and really forced to go surfing at a time that it was absurd. I couldn't walk across a room. I was conscious is a wrong word. So one of the things that happens with Lyme is you get what they call a brain fog. And it basically means it feels like your head is stuffed with cotton candy and you lose your ability to think. So I could focus about 20 minutes a day. And I could move barely. I could like walk across my apartment and that was about it. And I got dragged to the ocean and experienced a very profound altered state of flow, what I now know is a flow state. And the experience was very powerful and very compelling. And I went back to the ocean because I wanted more of this. And over the course of about 8 months, I went from 10% functional to about 80% functional. And that, you know, I had some questions. I was a science guy. So
no kidding.
Lyme is not, surfing is not a known cure for a chronic autoimmune condition. And I was also concerned. I'm a rational materialist. I was having what felt like quasi-mystical experiences in the waves, right? Like time was slowing down. I felt like I could see out of the back of my head, all these crazy things. And Lyme is only fatal if it gets into your brain. So even though I had miraculously gotten better, these altered states had sort of convinced me that the disease is definitely in my brain. I'm probably dying. And so I lit out on a giant quest to figure out what the hell was going on. And for a lot of reasons that have to do with the neurobiology of flow has very profound impacts on both our nervous system and our immune system, which are the things that go very wrong in Lyme disease or autoimmune conditions in general. So that I can go into the science if you're curious.
Yeah,
but
we'll
flow
get there
can
for
have
sure.
an impact on healing.
So
I surfed myself back to health, and I wanted to know what the hell was happening, and I figured out it was flow, and I figured out that the same thing that got me from sort of subpar back to normal was helping these athletes or these scientists or whoever else I was studying go from normal all the way up to Superman. It was like the opposite side of the same puzzle, and that's sort of where it started for me.
I mean, that is when I heard that story, and obviously I'd heard that story before, I was really blown away by the personal experience that you had to sort of get you here. And for all those people, I mean, I think people sort of understand the word flow, but let's actually just start there. Like the definition of flow, there's a lot of different versions of that. How do you define it?
There really isn't. So there isn't a lot of, there is this huge misconception in the public that there is a technical definition of flow, which is it is an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and perform our best. That's the definition of flow, and it has been forever. Now, what is all over the public is all these synonyms for flow: runner's high, being in the zone, being unconscious if you play basketball. If you're a stand-up comic, they'll sometimes call flow the forever box. But the experience, and spiritual traditions have all kinds of mystical names for flow, satori, and you know what I mean? It's endless. But they all refer to the same thing, which is an optimal state of consciousness where mental and physical performance basically just explode. And for listeners who aren't familiar with any of this, right? Flow refers to those moments, and we've all had this experience. You get so focused on what you're doing that everything else just disappears, right? And all aspects of performance go through the roof. It feels amazing. Performance is amazing. Time seems to slow down or speed up, and your sense of self disappears, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think you said it sort of is this near perfect decision making. And that's definitely interesting to me in that context. What do you mean by that? Flow elicits that perfect decision making.
A little history is useful on this one. So the foundational flow science is old. It's like 150 years old, but it got a huge leap forward in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s thanks to Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who is often called the godfather of flow psychology, right? He was the chairman of the University of Chicago psychology department, conducted this global study on flow. And when he went around the world asking people about the times in their life when they felt their best or performed their best, everybody sort of said the same thing. When I'm in this state, every action, every decision flows seamlessly, perfectly, effortlessly from the last. So flow is a phenomenological description. It describes how the state makes us feel inside, right? Very flowy, right? Things flow together. But for that to be possible, for every decision to lead to the next decision, right? And we've all had this experience. We've all been sort of in a creative flow state where you have a neat idea and it leads to another neat idea, it leads to another, right? That is what they're talking about. And so what you're looking is near perfect, high speed decision making. The brain evolved to do this. We're very good at it in crisis situations. So flow is essentially how the brain evolved to perform at its best. And the situations we are most adapted for are situations where we have to make a lot of fast, hard, complicated decisions all at once kind of thing. And so flow is very good for that. But as you pointed out, and I like to point out when I teach this stuff, it's near perfect. It's not perfect, right? There's a famous extreme skier, early extreme skier, so we can call him extreme skier, named Scott Schmidt. And he had this phrase. He used to say that flow makes me feel like Superman up until the moment I'm not. So, right, important safety tip there.
Absolutely. Yes,
and we've had this experience, right? You have a creative flow state, and you have all these brilliant ideas, and then you come back to them after the flow state, and 3 or 4 of them might be really good, but there's like 10 or 12 of them that are absolute shit, right?
Not exactly. No, I definitely have had that experience. And it's interesting. I set like a 1-word intention every year at the beginning of the year, and I share that on my newsletter. And this year it was flow. And so it's very, very relevant that you're talking about this. But what I love about you is that you really do like to look at the science of things, and you're a science writer, which makes this so interesting to me. Can you explain actually the science of what is happening when we're in that flow state? Like, what is going on in our brains? Why is this actually happening?
So that's at the Flow Research Collective, that's what we do, right? We study the neurobiology of peak performance, and we want to know what's going on inside the brain. In fact, you started this podcast by asking for my personal story. And whenever people ask for my personal story, I wince. And it's the reason I wince is everything we have learned about peak performance. When we say the term peak human performance, all we really mean is getting your biology to work for you rather than against you. And I always tell people, personality doesn't scale. What happens in peak performance, the general error everybody makes is they figure out what works for them, and then they teach other people. And I can guarantee you what works for me is not going to work for you. It's nature, it's nurture, right? That's fundamentally, but the system is biological. And so if you can get to the neurobiology, the mechanism, you can start to figure it out, right? The psychology is still squishy. It's hard. Behavioral neuroscience, so I sort of think I work in applied behavioral neuroscience, basically, which is taking, what is the neurobiology and turning it into psychology. So this is how the mechanism works, and this is what it translates to. And flow, we've been remarkably lucky in the whole field of researchers have been remarkably lucky in the past few years, because neuroscience is accelerating pretty much on an exponential growth curve, right? And so our ability to peer deeper and deeper into the brain over the past 20 years has gotten much better. I mean, there's still a ways to go. There are problems with fMRI, there are problems with EEG, there are problems with MEG and all that stuff still. But we are getting really good at it, and it's been really fun. So we can now figure out, where flow is coming from. And it's gotten to the point for example, when I wrote Rise as Superman, which is my big book on flow, right? We understood the neurobiology, the brain stuff, but we understood nothing about physiology, the body, heart rate, all that stuff, facial expressions. We are now getting to the point, the field, not just the Flow Research Collective, though I think at this point we are running one of the largest flow labs in the world, but the field itself has gotten to the point that we now know, it's not proven, but when you're in flow, your smile muscles get hyperactive and your frown muscles paralyze. So, it may not be true across the boards, but there's good data. It came out of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, but really good. So we're getting to the point of we understand, hey, what's going on in your brain, what's going on in your body. In fact, I always say that, when I wrote Rise of Superman, if you spoke neuroscience, I could have given you the flow definition using sort of this much space. And today I need this much space.
So much.
Right? We've gotten really precise.
Very
We're
cool. So
starting to get
just
really
going
precise.
back to that for people who aren't familiar, I mean, Ariel Garden was on last week. So, you know, she helped us understand a little bit about the brain and what was happening. But you have talked a little bit about this idea of like transient hypofrontality, right? And what that means when we're in a state of flow. Like really quickly, just explain for people what's turning on, what's turning off, and sort of what are some of the chemicals that are being produced? Because, you know, not everybody.
Let me back it out a second, give your listeners a framework
Sure.
for understanding the brain, because they hear these stuff, neurochemicals, Ariel was on, so I'm sure she talked brain waves, right? So and this is not a complete picture, this is a sort of neuro shorthand, because I'm not going to talk about genetics, I'm not going to talk about a bunch of shit. But when neuroscientists talk about the brain, they really want to know four things, which is neural anatomy and networks, so where in the brain something is taking place, and neurochemistry and neuroelectricity, which are the two ways the brain talks to itself, right, and to the body. It sends signals electrically or chemically. So that's the quick and dirty framework. Transient hypofrontality, which you asked, is a change in networks and neural anatomy. It basically means the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right back here, turns off. Transient means temporary. Hypo, it's the opposite of hyper. HYPO, it means to deactivate. And frontality goes to the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is a very powerful portion of the brain, but for example, you mentioned before we jumped on that Ariel had run her shut down the inner critic exercise for you. So the inner critic lives in your prefrontal cortex. It actually lives on the side of your prefrontal cortex in the dorsal lateral, which is a fancy way of saying upside. So the top side of your brain turns off in flow. And it's nothing fancier than an efficiency exchange. The brain uses a lot of energy. It's always trying to conserve. So in certain situations, it will say, hey, I'm going to turn off these structures so I can give you more energy over here to do something else. That's what's happening in flow. And as a bonus, that's why time passes so strangely in flow. So time is actually this calculation performed by like 6 different structures in the prefrontal cortex. And when the structures turn off, we can't separate past from present from future. Same thing happens to our sense of self, right? Sense of self in our cortex. When it turns off, we lose our ability to process our sense of, create our sense of self. And, you know, bonus, not only do we feel great when this happens, but transient hypofrontality means the inner critic, right? That nagging, always on defeatist voice in your head turns off. So we experience flow as liberation, as freedom, but we're literally free from ourselves. We're getting out of our own way from a neurobiological standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, that whole idea of getting out of our own way resonates so deeply with me, and I think so many others, especially in this knowledge worker economy, you know? And so obviously, I mean, a huge amount of people are dying to have this flow state and maybe just an altered state. And so I'd love to sort of make the connection, as you've done, you know, in Stealing Fire, this flow state, right? How do you achieve it, you know, other than sort of what you've said already? Like, what are different ways people are sort of looking to achieve this flow state? And especially since you're interested in exponential technology and novel ways to do this, what are you?
So I am and I'm not. People have a very mistaken assumption because they've read Stealing Fire, so they think I'm a big fan of psychedelics, and they've read my books on technology. And I always tell people the same thing. When I was a journalist, I covered a lot of things, including a lot of dangerous situations. And on 4 or 5 different occasions when I was shot at. And at none of those times could I look at the guy who's on the other end of the gun and say, excuse me, would you put that down while I take this mind-altering substance or use this technology to get into the zone so I can dodge your bullets or whatever, right? That doesn't happen. So at the collective, and this is not to say that there aren't technologies that are sort of being developed. I don't think there's no technology currently on the market that can actually produce flow. For example, like Ariel's technology, Muse. Muse is quite good at producing a low-grade trance state because it can shift brain waves. But flow is brain waves, neural anatomy, networks, neurochemistry. It's a big shift in the brain, and you can't do it by just hitting brain waves. You got to do a bunch of other things at the same time. So there's not a technology out there that does this. Pardon me?
I know, I'm just gonna say, I'm really happy that we're sort of getting into this topic because, you know, I've sort of been questioning, you know, yes, you can sort of hack, you know, consciousness, hack some of these states, but I'm
I don't think,
very, very
again,
curious.
there's no such, if you know any, for people who really know about peak performance, they will tell you there's no such thing as a hack. There are no shortcuts. There is where we started. There's just getting your biology to work for you rather than against you, right? That's William James, who is probably one of the most brilliant neuroscientists ever, even though he was an early psychologist and neuroscience really wasn't a field, but he said, the most important thing in all education is to get your nervous system, make your nervous system your ally instead of your enemy. And that's essentially all we mean by peak performance.
I love that.
And this is where, so to return to your earlier question, right? How do we get into flow? Let's jump back there. Right. And so I'm not going to talk about technology. I don't want to talk about substances, but we know that flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. There are 22 in total. Really simply, flow follows focus. It shows up only when our attention is in the right here, right now. So that's sort of what the triggers do. They help drive our attention into the present moment. If you speak neuroscience at all, they do this in one of three ways. They either drive neurochemicals, dopamine or norepinephrine into our system, which are focusing chemicals, or they lower cognitive load. And all those two things will help drive focus into the present moment. So that's what the triggers do. And there are a variety of really kind of straightforward ways to do this. For example, complete concentration in the present moment. So flow demands uninterrupted concentration. So the research going back to the 50s shows that if we want to sort of maximize flow and max attention, you want 90 to 120 minute blocks of uninterrupted concentration. So we teach people to start your day, unless you're a night owl. If you're a night owl, start your night work session, right? But everybody else, start your day with 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration, because that's how the biology is designed to work, right? We all know, for example, REM cycles are 90 minutes. It doesn't just happen while we're asleep. When we're awake, like our focus cycles are about 90 minutes long. So 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration, really easy way to do that. Or if you want to get jiggy with it, novelty, complexity, unpredictability, risk, creativity, the linking of ideas together, what's known as pattern recognition, all these things are dopamine triggers. So they all drive dopamine into our system. Dopamine drives focus. They can drive flow. So we've all had this experience. You've gone on vacation, right? You're in a new environment. You're doing whatever, and it's really flowy. Why is it flowy? Because novelty and unpredictability, where it's all new and I don't know what's going to happen, drives dopamine. In fact, if you put novelty and unpredictability together, this is what Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, who did this work, calls the magic of maybe. It's a 700% spike in dopamine. To put that in context, cocaine, the most addictive drug on earth, which all it does is drive dopamine into our system, cocaine is about 750% spike. So novelty and unpredictability together, you're almost getting the same level as one of the most addictive drugs on earth, only you're doing it internally without having to use a substance, right? Let me put this in context for your readers. One of the things we know that happens in flow is learning rates. One of things that's really interesting to you go through the roof. Studies by the U.S. Department of Defense find learning rates can accelerate 240 to 500% in flow. Wow. So I take advantage of that. I read a lot of textbooks, a lot of neuroscience textbooks. They're not always the most fun to read, right? But I gotta learn everything. So I like to read. I like to take my textbooks on the road. I go to even just like a cafe that I haven't been to before. Novelty, unpredictability increases dopamine. Dopamine increases focus. All I need is something in the text in the book to sort of excite me a little bit, right? Or make a connection between two ideas. That's a little pattern recognition. Pretty soon you're in a flow. So it's a quick way, easy way to improve learning, right? We all can do stuff like that. I think the point.
I was just gonna say, I think. There's so much amazing information that you're sharing. And one of the things that's coming up for me as you're sharing this, especially around this time, is, these triggers, right, to actually get you into flow state. How do you think they're shifting right now in this, pandemic environment where people are moving to work from home, do you see this as, an opportunity for more people to get into flow state? Or how do you think the world is changing? How do you think the changes in the world are impacting access to flow state?
So, wow, that's a big question. Okay. There's sort of 2 or 3 answers to this. So let me start by saying I believe we're seeing 3 different things happening in the world right now. We're seeing 3 pandemics. The first pandemic is COVID, right? It's COVID-19.
Yeah.
It's the actual pandemic, and with all the kind of pain and suffering and heartbreak that brings. Then the second pandemic was clearly that pandemic of fear that I think is starting to ease up a little bit, but it's still there. And the third pandemic is the antidote to the first 2, which is the pandemic of cooperation that is erupting globally to sort of combat what's going on. And so I'm not going to really talk about the medical side of it, the first pandemic, right? COVID-19.
Sure.
Though I will say from experience, it is very difficult to get into flow if you're sick. Like it's hard.
Sure.
Flow is a high energy state. It can be very difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. What we know about fear is that fear blocks flow. A little bit of fear is really useful. A lot of fear, a pandemic level, epidemic level fear, it will block flow. So you have to get control of your nervous system, right? That's the first thing. If you're interested in flow, and this is not flow work, this is like basic peak performance. So like mindfulness, gratitude, exercise, sleep, hydration, nutrition, right? Like social support, reach out and hug someone. Those things calm your nervous system down, right? So you got to be really on top of all that crap to even get into the conversation. On the other hand, cooperation, collaboration, all that stuff, there's group flow, right? This is a team performing at their best. And all those things can really be drivers of flow because social situations in general, we know there's a little risk involved. You get a little dopamine for free. And if you and I start connecting, we're going to get a little oxytocin for free, right? So really good drivers of flow. So there's different ways, but I think the biggest thing for people working at home, and so another one of the flow triggers is what is known as clear goals. Clear goals. So when you talk about peak performance, you talk about goal setting, you really want to talk about 3 levels of goal setting. I know you're friends with Salim Ismail, so what Salim, what Peter Diamandis and myself call massively transformative purpose, right? Like you need a mission statement for your life, whatever it is. This is your massively transformative purpose. Then you need high hard goals. High hard goals are like, let's say your massively transformative purpose is I want to do blank to change the world, right? Whatever it is. Your high hard goal, let's say it's you want to write books that change the world, right? So your high hard goal should be I want to write a book on X or Y or Z, right? It's a chunk down goal. And then underneath that, you want what are called clear goals. This is your daily to-do list. But a clear goal is nothing. What's interesting about clear goals is, especially if you say it to Westerners, when you say goals to Westerners, they hear goals. They don't hear clear. They focus on the end point, right? And that's not what we're talking about. Clear goals, first of all, they're not outcome goals, right? Outcome goals is I want to win the basketball game, or I want to, get a raise at work, or you want to focus on process goals. Process goal is, if a clear process goal for I want to write a book that changes the world is I want to write 500 words today. And if I want to make it really clear, and this is how, as a writer, I set up my clear goals in the morning, it's I want to write 500 words today that make my readers feel excited or terrified or whatever it is, right? That's a very clear goal. I know if I succeeded, very, very specific. Doesn't need to be complicated, but it has to be very, very clear. The reason is I said earlier that these triggers either drive norepinephrine and dopamine or they lower cognitive load. When goals are clear, brain doesn't have to wonder, what am I doing? What do I have to do next? It knows, right? Cognitive load gets lightened, frees up extra energy. You can repurpose it for focus. You have an easier time getting into flow. So when you have to start working from home, the biggest problem people have is uninterrupted concentration and knowing how to structure their time. So we have been just training people in COVID. Like if you're gonna let me back up and say one other thing. And this is not my work. This is work done by Charles Duhigg. Talks about it a little bit in The Power of Habit. He points out, and there's good research that backs it up, that crises, times of crises, are really good times for laying down new habits. It has to do with neurochemical changes in the brain, but if you can sort of manage your fear levels, crises are fantastic. You can lay down new habits really quickly. So the habits I always tell people to lay down during COVID is, again, if you don't have a gratitude practice, you don't have a mindfulness practice, you don't get regular exercise, you're not getting enough sleep at night, you're not hydrating and eating good food, well, start. Just do that shit for starters, because you can't really get into the high performance game until you do, right? The other thing, we're not going to talk about that. But so then just practice a little distraction management. So like I like at the end of my day, I prepare the workspace for the morning. Turn off everything, right? Twitter goes off, Facebook goes off, shut down all my distractions, right? Turn it all off so that when I walk in, I write my clear goals list at the end of the day. So by the time I hit my computer first thing in the morning for my 90-minute to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration, I've got everything filed and ready. I know what I'm doing. I can dive right in. It's none of this is hard, complicated rocket science. But I will tell you, an older company of mine did a training at Google where we literally taught them 4 flow triggers, right? Clear goals, uninterrupted concentration, and a couple others. And we saw, after a 6-week training, a 35 to 80% increase in flow. And that was 7 years ago. We are so much better at it now. If you were to take, like the Flow Research Collectives, our foundational training is called 0 to Dangerous. We measure flow pre and post, and we put thousands of people through it already. And on average, we've 70 to 80% increase in flow. And it's not because our Kung Fu is so good. I mean, I'd like to think our Kung Fu is so good, but it's the biology. It's literally, if you follow the biology, this shit is automatic.
It makes tons of sense to me because I've read lots of your work and I've followed a lot of these things, and it really, really does matter. And I wanted to sort of take the conversation to the connection between flow and creativity, right? So I'm very, very interested in the future of education and learning, and what are the skills that are going to be the most important skills for the next century. And we're certainly living in unprecedented times, right? Exponential change, lots of uncertainty, recognition that we're in a complex adaptive system. Tell me more about the connection between flow and creativity, right? So I know you've done a lot of work and you've done, a bunch of studies around creativity as well. Can you share sort of some of your insights there?
Yeah, for sure. So so the first thing to know is that in flow, creativity and innovation skyrocket. And the reason is, so creativity is always, as I'm sure you know, it's a recombinatory process. It's what happens when the brain takes in novel information, combines that with something old, and creates something new with it, right? You see something in the environment that latches onto an old memory, and it turns into something, and boom, you have an insight, you have inspiration, creativity happens. Flow surrounds this process. It's actually the neurochemicals that underpin flow, and I won't get technical, but basically in the state, we take in more information per second, so data acquisition goes up. We pay more attention to that incoming information, so salience goes up, so we'll notice more novelty. We have more raw material for creativity. We find faster connections between incoming information and older ideas, so pattern recognition goes up. We find farther flung connections between incoming information and older ideas, so lateral thinking, outside the box thinking, divergent thinking, whatever you want to call it, goes up. And then because creativity, right, definition of creativity is the creation of novel ideas that are useful being the operative word, which means it's not good enough to have the cool idea. You got to take it into the world, do something with it. That's risk. That requires risk taking. So risk taking also gets boosted, right? Some of this is because of transient hypofrontality shutting down, right? The inner judge who's always making you doubt your creative ideas, right? But some of this is neurochemistry. And so in studies, We've done some work. There was really good work done at the University of Sydney, also in Australia, and there was some interesting work done at Harvard that I'll talk about in half a second. So in our work and the stuff in Sydney and a couple of other people's work, we'll see creativity spike 400 to 700%. And we actually, like, those numbers sort of came out of this University of Sydney study where they were looking at one specific kind of creative problem solving. We wanted to say, okay, well, creativity has, if you go into the literature, you'll know that creativity has been subdivided into endless amounts of steps. There's idea generation, there's problem identification, there's blah, 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 execution, all that stuff. We broke it down into sort of the 8 core steps and then measures individually, and we saw the same thing at each of those steps. There were a couple steps actually in the creative chain that didn't seem to be impacted by flow. That was a little surprising, but as a general rule, across the board, it went up. And Teresa Amabile at Harvard, this is the coolest thing. So flow, there's no cardinal rule on how long a flow state will last, but in general, a couple of hours. Mostly because the neurochemicals that produce it burn out, right? After a little while, they go away, and then you have to replenish them. And so there's a recovery period on the back end of a flow state, so you have to sleep, you have to recover on the back end. But in flow, when they're at the peak concentration, you get this huge spike, but the creativity that comes from flow, the heightened creativity, Teresa Amabile figured out that it will outlast the flow state by a day, sometimes 2.
Wow.
So, for example, this is why another thing that we always tell people when they want more flow in their life, people have what I like to call, what we like, primary flow activity. This is that thing you did as a kid. For me, it's skiing, right? But it's like 90% of the time I go skiing, I'm in a flow state. I love it. I've loved it since I was 5. It's instant flow. We all have something like that, right?
Surfing.
Maybe it's hip hop dancing. Maybe it's playing backgammon. I don't care. We all got it. We did it.
Sure.
We always tell people, reboot that activity. This is really important during COVID also. Like, I can't ski. I'm 53 years old, and I've turned my backyard into a dry land ski park. We're skiing on dirt and sand. It's stupid, but there's a reason for it, and the reason is if I can put myself into a flow state this way, 2 things happen. 1, flow is essentially a focusing skill. Right. And it's a very peculiar kind of focusing skill, but it's a focusing skill. So it's very trainable, like any other. Mindfulness, meditation is a different kind of focusing skill, right?
Sure.
We can train the brain to focus in different ways. Flow is one of those ways, sort of, but that's a decent way to think about it. So the more flow you get, the more flow you get. If I get flow while skiing, if I come back to work, a day later, that's going to translate. It's going to help me focus on the job more importantly, if I get into a flow state skiing on a Monday, Tuesday, that heightened creativity it's still going to be present. So it's sort of a double bonus. Right. And as you pointed out,
I love
we
that.
We've been looking at it. Creativity is a very cool question. And so the other thing that you have to sort of understand about flow that is useful in thinking about this is, when you talk about what does flow amplify, right? Optimal performance, what does it actually mean? So there's physical stuff, right? Strength goes up, pain goes away, fast twitch muscle response goes up, a couple other things. Bigger impacts are cognitive. And the list is weird, but I'll give you the list and then I'll explain it in a way that everybody will get in a second. But it's interesting to your creativity stuff.
And
so we see motivation.
I'm going to tell Stephen, just before you do that, I'm just telling people, if you have questions, we got a bunch already in our Q&A. You can also put them on social media. We'll check our social channels as well as on the Zoom Q&A, and we'll get to those in about 5 minutes. So keep going. Yes.
All right. So we see motivation and productivity go up in flow, creativity and innovation. There's accelerated learning. We also see happiness, mostly meaning and overall life satisfaction, right? Positive psychologists now have 3 definitions for happiness, and 2 of them include flow. The highest 2 levels of happiness we can achieve on this planet involve flow. So there's a direct correlation there. Also creativity, cooperation, collaboration. Why such a motley assortment? Evolution shaped the brain for flow, to perform at its best. And evolution was shaped primarily by scarcity. It's the biggest driver of evolution. There are 2 possible reactions to scarcity. You can fight over dwindling resources, or you can do, you can go to the other side and you can create get creative, get cooperative, get innovative, and make new resources. So all the stuff that gets amplified in
I
flow
love the
is
linkage.
essentially
Yeah.
innovation, right? Flow is a state
Yeah. And I
designed
love,
to help humans innovate their way out of problems. That's what.
yeah. Oh, that's so powerful. And just connecting the dots for people around abundance, new technologies, exponential curves, and this idea that it actually does relate to scarcity, right? It's a response to scarcity that's just different, right? Which is to
It
create
is.
new as opposed to fight for the old. And I think that's super, super relevant in a post-COVID world that we're about to enter, as we
It's
see
also.
new. Yeah.
Oh, please. No, it's let you see new. What were you saying?
I know.
Uh,
No, I was just going to say,
um,
as we see a bunch of old habits and old practices die, and a bunch of new technologies, habits, practices emerge, right? So, go ahead.
One of the other things that is worth knowing, because we've been talking a lot about exponential technology, is, if you've read Abundance or Bold, you know that the human brain has limitations, right? The brain it evolved in an environment that it was local and linear. Local, right? Everything we dealt with was a day's walk away. Linear, the
Absolutely.
rate of change was really slow. We live in a global and an exponential world, so the brain actually can't perform at speed or at scale. It's built-in
Yeah.
limitations because we evolved in an environment that was neither global nor exponential. In flow is the only time you can actually process change at speed or at scale. So those filters, for a bunch of
Nice.
neurobiological reasons, actually come off. So if you really want to thrive in an exponential world, if you want to actually be able to use this accelerating technology, you have to have flow as sort of part of your blueprint. And I think, Salim talks a lot about exponential organizations. And, he'll be the first to tell you that you can't run an exponential organization without flow. It's not possible.
Absolutely.
So if you
Yeah.
want to keep up in a post-COVID world, this stuff isn't really optional.
Yeah, I love that. And obviously a game changer. We invest in companies, we advise, and we coach companies. And it's really around that connection between, if you're going to be able to create change, right, or new things, you absolutely have to change your mindset. And it totally relates back to your work. And I hope to send lots of people to the Flow Research Collective as a result, because I fundamentally believe in this trifecta that you're talking about.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah. So, Stephen, this has been so much fun. We could go on for many more hours from my perspective, as there's just so much material you've covered and that you are researching and truly on the leading edge of. But I'm going to hand it over. I have so many great questions from our audience, and thank you all for sharing these great questions. The first one I'm going to do is, from David Marr, does flow change with age? I think that's a really interesting question. And maybe you can talk about kids and sort of people in their later years.
So kids are developmentally flow prone because the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed till you're 25. So it's easier for them to shut it off. Also, we didn't talk about brainwaves, and I won't, but kids, the natural brainwave state of children is much similar to where you have to go for flow. So kids are very flow prone. And you see this, the self-awareness component is difficult with kids because you need a lot of self-awareness. Like we try to teach some kind of level of radical self-awareness, right? Just what's going on inside myself. So you need that to really do this work. But if you can get kids to understand, what's going on inside, and then sort of train them, is very effective. As you age, a bunch of things happen. I actually think the older people over 50, so there are significant developmental changes that happen around 50, and they're not automatic. You have to do certain things to sort of guarantee these changes. But after you go through this shift, I think there are certain things that really make flow proneness much more reliable. But I think one of the things that happens, and I think this is over time to people who do flow, is a really big high. It feels really, really, really good. Over time, I think you just become less attached to the high. Like it happens, but you just don't ride the emotional wave that high. And on the other side is you don't ride the lows as low, right? You spend a lot more time in the middle, on that middle path. And it sounds kind of boring, right? The roller coaster that is youth starts to go away. And it's just much more fun. And I think it makes flow much easier to get into, because without those huge highs are expensive. They're neurobiologically expensive. You burn up a lot of stuff.
What happens in the low states of flow? Like just to like
finish
that, because that's
so there's not a low state in flow, but there's a flow cycle. So flow is a 4-part cycle. It's not a binary. You don't get to live in flow. You have to go all the way through this cycle. And on the front end, there's a struggle phase. We talked about how the prefrontal cortex goes away in flow. In struggle, it's really active. That inner critic is really active. And you actually have to ride that struggle phase for a bunch of biological reasons right to the edge of frustration. So frustration and being able to deal with frustration is baked into this work. You can't get there without it, right? So one of the things that we spend a lot of time working with people on, if you're going to do this work, if you're going to do anything with peak performance, you've got to get really comfortable with being uncomfortable for a lot of different reasons, right? Fear has to become your friend. You have to get uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, a bunch of that stuff. It was funny. I was out doing dirt skiing with a buddy over the weekend, and we built this crazy thing. And, it was a lot like the first time we stood on the top of the hill and looked out at what we had built, we were both like, oh shit, really? We did that? We're really going to, like, and afterwards, my buddy looked at me, he was like, it's fun. It's been a little while since I scared myself. It feels really good. And I was like, yeah, man, really feels good. So that's a very flowy trait, right? It's a very flowy trait to be like, oh yeah, helpful. I like scaring myself. It feels really good, right? That's very part and parcel of this work. So the dark side of flow, right, is the struggle phase. And then the recovery phase on the back end, if you're not prepared for it, you've run out of neurochemistry. So you've run out of good neurochemistry. So like earlier, I'll give you, there's a way to use it and a way not to use it. We started off this podcast talking about how in creative flow states, not every idea is a great idea. I always tell people, do your creative work in flow, go back and look at it again in that recovery state. Don't try to fix it, but just look. I will go back and I'll edit my stuff. I don't try to fix anything because I don't have the right neurochemistry but I've got no feel-good neurochemistry. So I'm basically in a bad freaking mood. And so if I go back and I read my writing and I like it, I know it's good. Something good. I can be really it seems like, and you can make this argument, though I don't know, I'm hesitant because I don't necessarily know if the science is all the way there, but it seems like if evolution created flow for innovation, this recovery period on the back end, we know that part of every innovation cycle is a verification process, right? In the creative cycle, the last phase is verification. And it seems like flow, the recovery phase is perfect for that. You just can't take it too seriously, right? Because there's no more feel-good neurochemistry. So you literally are going to feel bad by design. So you have to basically, please.
I think what's coming up for me when you say that, and then I want to go back to the questions because we only have about 12 minutes left, but is this idea of reflection, mixed with like not being in that flow state? Because one of the things that really resonated or I had questions about was you lose your sense of morality in a flow state. You lose a whole bunch of critical decision-making things that are actually very useful, right? They're
don't go shopping in a flow state.
Right. Don't go shopping in a flow state. And I think it's like a very important message as it relates to flow around how far you can push things and then the unintended consequences of those things. So, it's a whole other talk. Hopefully we can
There's a whole other deep well on that. But it's not self-help, right? It's hard to fuck up self-help. You can screw this up though, and it has consequences.
No, we're seeing it even with some of the exponential technology, but that's for another day. We have great questions. So from Lindsay Holland, can you jumpstart the sense of flow with visual and auditory cues?
It's a great question, Lindsay. We looking at the visual question a little bit with Dr. Andrew Huberman. He's at Stanford. He's a neuroscientist and an ophthalmologist. The answer is yes. but we don't know exactly what those visual cues are. Novelty, complexity, and unpredictability are visual cues, but it can get much more specific. And as far as sound goes, we know music is a flow trigger. What I want to caution you, there is zero proof that any of the technologies that are designed auditorily to trigger flow, I have seen nothing convincing that says one of them will work for everybody. There are very good things out there, but they're very individual. So, when I ski, it's always hip hop or punk rock. That's probably not really flowy for most people, right? A lot of people like classical music or what, right? I like really, really, really loud metal and punk. So, it differs very.
Yeah, great. So the next question is, do you believe high performance people like Olympic athletes have reached their absolute peak in terms of physical performance? And is there any way we as humans in our current physiological state can advance any more without evolution?
So, clearly we can advance a whole lot more without evolution, right? Because we keep doing it. Now, there is, in the 20th century, we've been experiencing what Nobel laureate Robert Fogel calls technophysio-evolution, right? Our technology is driving evolution forward. So it's hard to say completely without it. But the other thing is, in high performance, everybody will tell you at the elite level, talent is levels out, right? There are the LeBron Jameses in the world who are just freak athletes, right? Or the Simone Biles, right? Where you're just like, holy crap, what am I looking at there? But as a general rule, 90% of performance is mental at the elite level. And we are just at the front edge of understanding mental high performance. For example, as my friend Michael Gervais likes to say, high performance coach for the Seattle Seahawks, we can't yet measure thought. What is a thought? How much does it weigh? What is it looking like in the brain? Can we track it all the way through, right? So once those things haven't even begun to be tapped. So I don't think we're anywhere close to the level of human performance. I don't think we have any idea. And the simple example I like to give, for example, is big air competitions in skiing and snowboarding. There was a belief in the 1990s that 60 to 80 feet was the most impact a human being could take off a cliff. Now we've got people who are jumping 250, 260, 300 feet, right, and landing it and snowboarding away, skiing away, and we haven't hit the top of that. That's just where we are right now. This, over and over and over again. So I don't think we're anywhere close to the edge.
Yeah, so interesting. Another question I really love, because I think you talk about this a little bit, which is, does flow need a feedback loop, or does the feedback loop impact flow? For example, in sports, you see the impact of your flow really quickly, but in certain business environments, there's a slower feedback loop. How do you connect?
Yeah, we've talked. So immediate feedback's a flow trigger. And the best example of this is in medicine. So the only class of doctors that improve after medical school are surgeons. Everybody else, their skills go down over time. Surgeons go up. Why? If somebody dies on the table, that is immediate feedback, right? But if you're a radiologist reading radiological screens, which I know AIs are doing now, so this is an old example, but if you were a radiologist, you can often read radiological screens and you never even find out if the patient lived or died. There's no feedback built in. So we teach people to tighten feedback loops, right? Yeah. And we take this a little bit farther. There's what I've dubbed, for lack of a better phrase, and I hate inventing new terms, but I don't know what else to call this. So what I call a minimal feedback for flow, right? Everybody's got the low amount. So what I tell people to do is, if you don't know what that is, study your life. Watch when you get into flow. Ask yourself, what kind of feedback did I get, right? And figure out, in your key activities, what's the minimum amount of feedback you need actually to get into flow, and then build that into the system, right? For example, I teach a course called Flow for Writers, and I assign people feedback buddies. And I don't want them to review everything, but one or two things that are really helpful. Figure out what those are. Ask your feedback buddy for it. Because it's the other thing, you've got to, like, if you're going to work with somebody else on feedback, this is like, nobody knows your work better than you. You have to be very cautious with other people's feedback, right? So you want to, like, give them a container. You don't want to say, hey, just come in and tell me everything that's wrong with my life. Because first of all, right, how the fuck did they know? And second of all, you don't want, it's demotivating. You just want a couple of things. So yeah, tighten feedback loops, really important.
Super helpful. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up, because I know people have usually a 2 o'clock deadline. But this one was a really good one, which is, how do I think about getting both sides of the brain to work better together? Your creative side and your logical side. Does flow help you do that?
So let's just start. Let's start with the neuroscience, which is to say, you don't have a creative side or a logical side. That is really bad neuroscience that has been thoroughly disproved. In fact, great book by my friend John Koinos called The Eureka Factor, probably the best book on creativity in the brain. The Wired to Create, Scott Barry Kaufman's book, is a close second, either of those. But there is no such thing as a right brain, left brain divide. What there is, your right brain has a tendency to see the trees. Your left brain sees the trees. Your right brain sees the forest. That is different. And by the way, there's also minor differences, male and female here. More work needs to be done. But so creativity is always the whole brain talking to itself. So you're not going to get your right side, your left side talking to one another better. They're already doing that anytime you're creative, which is like, you can be logically creative. We do it all the time, right? Maybe you don't want a logically creative tax accountant, perhaps, right? That maybe not the place to be logically creative, but mathematics is a very logically creative art, that sort of stuff.
I'm going to stop you there, Stephen.
Good. And by the way, John Koinos' book on the Eureka Factor has the best data. Until my book comes out, give me 6 months, I'll have a better book. But for now, I think John's book is the best book on how to train up creativity in the brain anyways.
No, so great. Stephen, I could literally continue talking to you for many, many hours. Thank you so much. Your work has had a huge impact on my life and so many others. So keep doing the amazing work you're doing. Everybody follow Stephen. He sends a daily newsletter. I think it's daily.
Not daily. No, it's not daily. It's weekly.
Sorry, weekly. As I said, that weekly newsletter. That's super great. And he has so many great books to read. So please, thank you so much for joining us today. And just a quick thank you to all the amazing people who make this show happen. Our production partner, Either Live, thank you. Corey Marr, the executive producer, Marone Tadas, and our amazing partners, Toronto Life, CBC, who else? Artery, Talk Boutique. If I'm missing any, I've lost my sheet. It's no longer in front of me. So thank you. And we'll see you next Monday at 1 o'clock. Have a great rest of your day, guys. Take care.